Prenatal development is talking about the development before birth. Before, natal birth, so all the time that you develop and all the things that develop before that you are born. So there's 3 phases of prenatal development: the germinal stage, the embryonic stage, and the fetal stage. The germinal stage is the first 2 weeks of the pregnancy. So you first have conception, which is the sperm fertilizing the egg, implantation, where after the egg has gone through several cycles of mitosis, it travels to the uterus and attaches itself to the uterine wall, right? So that's the implantation, it's implanting itself in the uterus. And then you have the formation of the placenta. So that's an organ that is what allows oxygen and nutrients to pass between the mother and the baby, and for any waste that the baby produces to leave through the mother, right? So it's attached through the umbilical cord to the baby, okay? The embryonic stage is from 2 weeks to 2 months. So this is the stage where we say is the highest vulnerability. This is where it's very easy for something to go wrong. This is when the baby is most sensitive to negative effects, because this is where you have the formation of the vital organs and systems, the heart, the spine, the brain. They're all beginning to develop. They don't work yet, they haven't fully developed yet, but because they are starting to develop, if something goes wrong, that can impede their development. And then the last stage is the fetal stage, from 2 months until birth. Okay, so the body continues to grow. The sex organs develop by the 3rd month, so this is when you get to know whether the baby is a boy or girl. The baby is able to start moving around in the uterus. And within the last 3 months, the brain cells start to multiply rapidly, right? So you have a rapid increase of brain cells. Now, when we talk about the age of viability, this is when a baby can be born premature and still survive. Okay, so we've gotten it as early as 22 to 26 weeks in the pregnancy. Science and medicine has advanced far enough that we've been able to keep babies alive at this early stage. But it's still not good for them to be born at this point. They can be severely underweight. They're going to be more susceptible to getting sick. So obviously carrying it full term, which is about 38 weeks, would be better. But we can keep a baby alive who's born much earlier. So as you can see in this visual kind of timeline on page 434 of your textbook, this shows you the growth and development of the baby across the weeks since conceptions, right? So around 4 months, you can start hearing the heartbeat. At 6 months, your visual and auditory senses are functional, right? They are open. There's not much to see, but they can see and hear when they're in the womb. At 8 months, they start kind of forming their little circadian rhythm. And at 9 months, they have rapid weight gain. They can get the immunity from their mother, and then birth at full term, which is about 38 weeks. So like we said earlier, the baby and the mother are connected through the placenta. So anything that happens to the mother will happen to the baby, right? That's why we talked about that sensitive period, right? That critical period. So we're going to talk about a couple of things that could severely affect the baby negatively, right? So we call these the teratogens, right? Anything that's going to negatively affect a developing child. So maternal nutrition is very, very important. The mother not only has to eat enough to sustain herself, but now she has to also eat enough nutrients to sustain a growing baby. So malnutrition, right, being undernourished, is linked to birth complications. The baby could have neurological, so brain problems, and psychopathology, right? They have a high vulnerability to develop schizophrenia. They've done studies where people with schizophrenia, when they've looked back at the mother's pregnancy, many women with schizophrenic babies were undernourished, right? So not a causation, but a correlation. It does seem to have an effect, or it does seem to make them more vulnerable, again, more likely. So maternal drug use, both legal, OTC is over the counter, so things like Aleve, Tylenol, Motrin, right? Things that we take every day for pain and things like that, and illegal drugs, both of them can impair the baby's development, lead to birth defects, right? So the typical things like smoking, alcohol, prescription and recreational drugs, all of those can be transferred to the baby through the placenta, right? Anything that the mom takes in, medicine, food, drink, gets passed on to the baby, okay? And fetal alcohol syndrome is when the mother drinks too much alcohol. This is the leading cause of babies being born with mental disabilities. It affects both their motor and mental development, and they can also have face defects. Okay, so that's one of the most common reasons for mental disabilities, that the mother drank throughout the pregnancy. Now, maternal illness is also very dangerous. If the mother gets sick, the baby can also get sick as well. So these are the common sicknesses that are going to influence the development of the child. So this is why prenatal health care is so important. So prenatal, pre-birth health care, right? So this is when mothers should be seeing an OB/GYN or going to an OB/GYN, right, to get prenatal vitamins, right, to have those checkups where they check on the baby to make sure that everything's okay so that they can catch, any issues early on. So earlier care is correlated with higher survival rates and lower rates of being born premature. The issue is that prenatal care is very expensive, right? If you don't have insurance, if you don't have the good finances, it's not easily accessible for everyone. So many women in poverty cannot access prenatal care, so then they have higher risk pregnancies. And if they can't access prenatal health care, they probably can't access health care for themselves. So that puts them at an even higher risk because they are already not necessarily getting the care and treatment that they may need in their own day-to-day lives. Okay? So the prevention through guidance is just talking about those health professionals that women see. So OB/GYN is referring to obstetrician and gynecologist, right? So an obstetrician is someone who specializes in prenatal and postnatal care, so for the babies and delivering, they're the ones who deliver the babies. And then a gynecologist specializes in women's health. Okay, so then the preventative care for children is just taking those steps early on to ensure their health, right, if it's accessible to you. So as you can see in this graph, this is comparing amongst many of the major countries in the world the infant mortality rate. So out of every 1,000 births, how many infants unfortunately don't make it? So Sri Lanka and Russia tend to have the highest infant mortality rates. The United States is on the lower end of the graph, towards the middle of the graph, so it's not great, but it's not the worst. So the countries with the best infant mortality rate in terms of having the lowest infant mortality rate are Sweden, Japan, Finland, Norway. So something that we could say is probably correlated, may not be the cause, but it's definitely a correlation, is that those countries with the lowest infant mortality rates tend to have some sort of socialized form of healthcare where everyone has access to healthcare. Obviously this is going to have different economic issues and things like that, but because prenatal care is more accessible and more affordable, then women are able to get the treatment that they need during their pregnancy, which makes it less high risk. Again, it increases survival rates and it decreases prematurity rates. So now when we're talking about motor development, we're talking about how the babies are going to develop the muscle coordination so that they can do physical activities, right? Walking, running, crawling, all that stuff. So we have two main principles, the cephalocaudal trend and the proximal distal trend. So the cephalocaudal trend says that we develop head to foot, where we gain control of your upper body and your head before you gain control of your butt and your legs. And the proximal distal trend is that you gain control of your torso before your extremities, meaning your arms and legs as well. And these happen at the same time, right? Babies can like roll over on their stomachs and lift their heads, right? So they do that before they're able to kind of really gain control and have the muscle strength in their legs to stand up, right? So when we're talking about maturation in this chapter, or at this section of the chapter really, we're just talking about their physical maturation, right? The unfolding of their genetic blueprint. We're not talking about like emotional, mental maturation. So not like that someone's acting immature. We're only talking about the physical aspects of maturation. So basically, you have to have a certain amount of time pass for your body to develop the physical capabilities, right? But experience does have a large influence. And we're going to talk about this when we talk about the cultural variations a little bit in a second. So when we talk about developmental norms, we are referring to the average age at which babies are able to do certain things, right? So these are useful as benchmarks, right, to know whether or not your baby's development is on a normal trajectory, okay? So we'll see on the next slide, right, the graph that shows the averages for each kind of benchmark, and we'll discuss a little bit more about that on the next slide. So cultural variations, what they mean here is that there are certain cultures, and if you read in the textbook, there are certain cultures that encourage different things. So babies in those cultures will reach certain benchmarks either before or after the average, right? So there's a tribe in the Amazon who doesn't really encourage their babies to explore on their own because the Amazon is extremely dangerous, and there's all these dangerous poisonous animals, right? Carnivores that could attack the baby. So they keep the babies very close. They generally carry them for their first year, so they are delayed in terms of crawling and walking compared to other babies. On the other side, there's another group, I don't remember where they're from, I forgot to look it up, but they encourage their babies to become more mobile and start standing at earlier ages than average, right? Because they move a lot. I don't remember. I think it's an agricultural society, so they focus more on like getting the babies up and moving. But either way, so these cultures, these experiences are going to influence how early or how late a baby is going to reach a benchmark. However, in general, outside of these kind of specific examples, most babies reach these benchmarks at around the same age, right? Your similarities outweigh the differences. So this is the importance of genetics, right? Your genetics is going to determine your development. Your environment can influence it, but it can't change its course, right? That whole nature versus nurture. So in development, in this case, nature, your genetics, plays a huge part in your development, and nurture, your environment, can influence it, but it can't completely change it. So as you can see in this graph that's on page 438 of your textbook, they have the age in months at the bottom, and then all the different benchmarks right in the orange with the black band. The black band is the average, right? This is when most babies will do these physical benchmarks, okay? So notice the orange, right, because this was done in a study, the orange is everyone who didn't fall into the average. So sometimes you have a good amount of babies, at least in this study, who were much later than the average, a couple that were earlier, some that were, equal. But in general, babies will reach these benchmarks within a month or two, right, of the average. So this is something to just keep in mind, right, that parents keep in mind as their baby is developing, to kind of see, to make sure that they're on the right track. They don't always have to be right on average. Again, you see that a lot of the babies kind of fell outside of the average, but as long as they're in the range of a couple of months, it should be okay. Like, for example, I was very early in the standing, holding on to something and standing up. I was standing up in my crib and running around very early on, versus my younger brother. My brother didn't want to walk. He was a very lazy baby. He loved to sleep. They had to wake him up in order to feed him, keep him on a schedule. So my brother was much later in his walking, moving around development. Okay, so even within a family, you can have differences in the development, the maturation of the babies. So now we're going to talk about temperament, right? So temperament is kind of like a baby's personality in a sense, right? So Thomas, Chess, and Birch did a longitudinal study on the temperament of babies. So they asked the parents to give them reports on the baby's mood, their activity level, and their emotional reactivity, okay? So from this study, they came up with 3 basic temperament styles, and they saw that your temperament is usually established by 2 to 3 months, right? That first month, we're all just eating, sleeping, pooping, and crying, right? There's not much difference between all of us, right? We were fresh out of the womb, so it takes us a little while to kind of become a person. So about 40% of the babies fell into the easy category. They're generally very happy. They have a regular sleeping and eating schedule, so sleeping at night, eating during the day. They're very adaptable to change, right? They don't really mind when things kind of change, and they're hard to upset, right? They don't get upset very easily because they're kind of easygoing, right? So about 15% of babies were slow to warm up, so they were less happy, they had less regular sleeping and eating schedules, they were slow to adapt to change, and they had moderate reactivity. It wasn't easy to upset them, but they got more upset quicker than the easy babies. All right, so about 10% of the babies were difficult babies. They were glum, they weren't very happy, they were generally upset. They had random sleeping and eating schedules, so it wasn't always the same. They didn't like it when things were changing, and they were very easy to get upset. Okay, about 35% of the babies were in a mixed category where they didn't really fit into a single category. Sometimes they were easy, sometimes they were difficult, sometimes they were kind of slow to warm up, so they weren't really consistent in their temperament. Okay, what they had found though was that the temperament doesn't seem to change over time. So whichever category they fell into, they tended to stay in that category throughout their development, right? This was a longitudinal study, so they were able to track the development of individual babies over time. Okay. So what they've also found is that difficult children, right, babies who fall into the difficult category, tend to develop more emotional problems, right? They don't tend to have very good coping skills, right? They have a hard time connecting to people, right, because they're so volatile. So Kagan and Snidman in 1991 did a cross-sectional research study where they directly observed babies, right? So remember, cross-sectional, they look at different groups at different ages, right, all at once instead of tracking them over time. Okay, so they came up with inhibited versus uninhibited temperaments, right? So these are slightly different from the temperaments that Thomas, Chess, and Birch found, right? So an inhibited baby, about 15 to 20% of the babies they studied were shy, wary of unfamiliar situations and people, right? They didn't really approach strangers. They were uncomfortable in strange situations, right? So they found that children who exhibited this by the time that they were 2 were more likely to have anxiety issues in their adolescence. Not guaranteed, just more likely. And uninhibited, showed less restraint, right? They weren't as cautious around unfamiliar situations and people. So you can think of this as maybe like introverted versus extroverted babies, right? Babies who are friendly versus less friendly. Okay. They also found that this tends to be stable over time. There may be a genetic basis from this, but it can also be influenced by culture, right? If babies are used to being around a lot of different people, right? If they have exposure to a lot of different people early on, then they may become accustomed and more open to these strange situations versus babies who aren't exposed to these types of things, right? So by the time that they are exposed, it's more of a scary experience. Now, this visual on page 439 is kind of comparing the benefits and the disadvantages of both longitudinal and cross-sectional research. So in longitudinal research, you're able to study single individuals, right? And you can track the changes in their development, right? You're comparing them against themselves, so you can see directly what may be causing these changes in development. However, remember, longitudinal studies take a very long time and tend to be very expensive. Cross-sectional studies are done at one point where you grab different groups of people from different ages, right, and you study them all at once, you collect that data all at once, so it does tend to be cheaper to do, but it is at a higher risk of a cohort effect, right? One group may have had an exposure to a history-graded event that may have caused a cohort effect. So for example, right, someone in the age 10 age group was born before coronavirus, so they know what life is like before coronavirus, and someone in the age 6 group was born after coronavirus, so they only know life after coronavirus, right? So you have these differences in the situations that they grew up in, so that could change some of the data, or not change, but influence the data in ways that you may not expect, okay? All right, emotional development. So we measure our emotional development early on through our attachments, right? The close bonds that the infant has with their caregiver. So notice we say caregiver and not necessarily mother, because it's whoever is taking care of the baby that they are going to form the attachment with. So separation anxiety is the distress that we feel when we're separated from the people that we are attached to. So Ainsworth used separation anxiety as a way to measure the attachment level a baby had with a person, right? How strong their attachment was with them and the type of attachment that they would have, okay? So they created this strange situation, which you'll see in the video on the next slide that I will have linked on Schoology. So basically, the basic setup is that the mother goes into an unfamiliar room with the baby. They set the baby down. They let the baby get comfortable. A stranger comes in, and the mother leaves. So they see how the baby reacts to the mother leaving. And then the stranger leaves, and the mother comes back. So then they see how the baby reacts when mom comes back. So through the different variations of this setup, they found 3 major attachment styles: secure, anxious, ambivalent, and avoidant. So babies with secure attachments were comfortable when mom was around, right? They were able to play and explore the new room. They were upset when she left, and they were able to calm down when she came back. They were comforted by her coming back. Okay, so they found that babies with secure attachments have high self-esteem. They're very resilient. They tend to get along better with their peers. They tend to be more independent and self-confident, basically. So the anxious ambivalent attachments, these babies were anxious when mom was around. They weren't comfortable in the new situation. They were extremely upset when she left, but they weren't always comforted when she came back. It was like some of them were still upset with her for leaving, right? Avoidant attachments are babies that have very little contact with the mother. They don't really care when she leaves. They don't really care when she comes back, right? So they found that these early attachment patterns do influence the adult romantic relationships, right? They kind of influence the types of relationships that people would have in the future. Now, something that they may not have considered is that these babies may not have had, like in the anxious ambivalent or in the avoidant attachments, they may not have been very attached to their mothers. There may have been someone else that they were attached to that obviously was not there, so they had different reactions. So just something to consider. On page 442, there's this really nice flow chart that kind of explains how these different attachments develop, right? So it all starts with the purple box, where is the attachment figure close, attentive, responsive, right? Are they paying attention to the baby, right? If they're attentive to the baby, yes, it goes to the green. The baby feels secure, the baby feels loved and confident, so it develops a secure attachment. Okay, so if the parent, or the attachment figure, right, is not attentive, not responsive, right, not close, you either get defensiveness, right, where the baby holds a grudge, right, they're upset with the parent, so then they have an avoidant attachment, right, in the blue. So they just tend to avoid the parent. They don't really interact with the parent, but they do have proximity. They will sit near them, right? Or if the baby responds with fear and anxiety in the yellow, they develop the anxious ambivalent attachment. Okay, so they check in with the parent a lot. They want to be very close to the parent, right? They're very dependent on the parent, even though the parent doesn't really pay much attention to them, right? So notice they all feed back to the purple square again, right? So the babies are constantly, checking in with this, right? Is my parent close by? Okay, so depending on their response, right, the attachment figure's response is going to affect how the baby reacts. Okay, there's a lot of different ideas about how we develop these attachments, especially secure attachments. So they have found that the bonding at birth, right, that the parents immediately having contact with the baby, doesn't seem to be crucial for developing a healthy attachment. Especially just because the baby's so fresh out of the womb, right? There's still a lot that they don't understand. So that immediate first contact isn't necessary for a healthy attachment, but it is obviously something that's very nice and comforting. So people still do it, obviously. And Harlow did studies on monkeys, right? And contact comfort. So basically he separated baby monkeys from their mothers very early on. Obviously not something that we would do today. It's very unethical right now. Back then they didn't really consider that. So the baby monkeys were given 2 substitute mothers that were made out of wire. One of them was just plain wire and had a bottle with milk, and the other mother had no food but was covered in a soft material. And so in the study they realized that the baby monkeys preferred to spend a majority of their time with the soft mother that was covered in that material versus the mother with the food, right? So this shows the importance of contact comfort, right? That we often choose to feel safe and comfortable versus our survival eating instinct, right? So the babies would go to eat from the wire mother and then immediately spend the rest of their time feeling comforted by the softness of the other mother, okay? So daycare is actually not necessarily a bad thing, right? This whole separation of the baby from their caregiver for a little while is actually a good thing. They've seen that there are benefits of having these social interactions with other children of their age, peers in their age groups, right, for their development of their social skills. So there are benefits to daycare. And then there's a lot of cultural factors that influence the different types of attachments, right? Attachment in general is universal. Okay, so all babies have the different kinds of attachments, but how they are raised, right, like the general norms of raising a child is going to influence the type of attachment that's normalized and that's more common within the different cultures, right? So, for example, the Germans encourage their babies and their children to be more independent. So this tends to lead to more avoidant attachments, right, where the babies aren't really as dependent on their parents. Okay, so what's seen as a secure attachment can be very subjective. Again, it varies by culture, right? Different cultures are going to value different things, okay? And then the evolutionary perspectives on attachment. So Bowlby believed it was natural selection, right? Babies are programmed, quote unquote, with behaviors to trigger parents responding to them to protect them, to help raise them, things like that, right? Like how all of us, or most of us, can't stand hearing a baby cry, right? Our instinct is to get the baby to stop crying. So we do that by either feeding the baby, changing the baby, right? Trying to figure out what the baby wants to stop it from crying, right? So we are kind of forced to take care of the baby in that sense, right? In Bowlby's view. So Belsky came up with kind of a different view, right? That children are programmed to respond to the type of care that they get with the different attachment patterns. So it's more dependent on the child's response versus in Bowlby, it's more dependent on the parent response. as you can see on page 443, you have this graph showing the different percentage of infants that have the different types of attachment styles in different countries. So in general, most cultures have secure attachments as the most common level of attachment, but as you can see again in Germany, they have a very high percentage of babies that have avoidant attachments, and in Japan they have more anxious ambivalent attachments. But in general, most of them have secure attachments. So the fact that there are some slight differences in the other types of attachment patterns is then specifically linked to the fact that they have different cultures, different values, and things like that. So this flowchart looks at the influence of the evolutionary perspective, right, on attachment and how that determines future relationships, puberty, and the quote-unquote mating strategies, right? So the ancestral environment of a person, right, if their ancestors lived in a harsh, unsafe environment with not a lot of resources, the parents supposedly tended to were unresponsive, inconsistent. They didn't have a lot of time for the children because they were trying basically to survive. So the infants then had an insecure attachment. So the world is dangerous, you can't trust the world. So then the effect of the mating strategy and their puberty, right? So they're opportunistic in reproduction, right? So they would rather mate more, the quantity of mating, right? Have more partners, right? More chances of passing on the genetics, and early sexual maturation. Versus if the ancestral environment was safe, there was a lot of resources, the parents were able to be more responsive, pay more attention to the children, so the children had more secure attachments, right? The world is safe, I can trust people, so they focused more on the quality of their partners, right? Not the quantity, and they had late sexual maturation. So again, this is the idea of the evolutionary perspective, right? Why certain people will have certain attachments and not others.